Okay, good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to see everyone here. My name is Paul Gross. I'm a senior fellow here at the Begun Heritage Center. Many of you have participated in these sessions before. We are here to conclude our series that we've been doing on key moments, key events in Israeli history. We've looked at the Six-Day War. We've looked at the election of Menachem Begin in the Likud and its impact on Israel's economic and socioeconomic policy. We've looked at the what's known as the constitutional revolution in Israel. That was last week. And we're looking today at something which, like all the others, has a huge impact on the Israel of today. Particularly Israeli politics and where things stand with political parties, and I think also where things stand with the political attitudes of the population. We're going to be talking about and hearing about the decline or collapse. We'll see where our speaker goes with that, of the Israeli left, of what was traditionally known as the peace camp. If just a little bit of context, many of you will know, most of you will know that the labor movement was the founding political dominant force of Israel, both in the years immediately before the state and certainly in the first 3 decades after the state. And many of the figures that we know of, Ben Gurion, Golda Meir, Yitzhak Rabin, Shimon Peres, Moshe Dayan, are all members of that political camp. And today, the Labour Party barely exists, and the left is in disarray. We are very fortunate to have with us an extremely accomplished and expert speaker in the topic, and someone who I recommend you all Google his articles. They are extraordinarily, in my view, insightful and well written, and I think you can all benefit from learning from him. I'm going to introduce him momentarily. I'll just quickly say, for those of you new to this format, at the end of his presentation, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions by writing them in the chat box at the bottom of the screen, and I will read them out. Okay, without further ado, I want to introduce Dr. Shany Mor, who is a researcher at the Israel Democracy Institute, a postdoctoral fellow at the Herzl Institute for the Study of Zionism, and a research fellow at the Chaikin Institute for Geostrategy, both of which are at the University of Haifa. He's also an associate fellow at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College. He served as director of foreign policy on the Israel's National Security Council, and he holds a PhD from Oxford University and was a postdoctoral fellow at the Political Theory Project at Brown University, one of those short bios which makes me and possibly others feel very inadequate. Okay, I'm going to pass on to Dr. Shany Mor. Thank you, Shany, for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. And just from your introduction, I learned about all the other events that you've had, and I feel like I missed out. I wish I had been there for some of them, a few of those talks. It's a shame I'm only finding out about this right now. Let me make sure I'm seeing. Supposed to see it. All right, so I'm going to answer the question, what happened to the Israeli left? And the way I'm going to answer that question might be a bit odd or surprising for some of you. What I'm going to try to do is essentially split the discussion into 3 very unequal parts. One rather small part, one slightly larger part, and then the bulk will be in the 3rd part. The first part that I want to talk about, actually, ironically, given the question, the subject is what happened to the Israeli right? Because a huge amount of the left, as we know it in the last 30, 40 years, is essentially in opposition to a political program of the right, or what was once a political program of the right. And I want to ask, what was that program? Where did it go? And what is left of that for the left to oppose? The political program of the right, as it's formulated in the immediate years after 1967, after the Six-Day War, is essentially a program to what I call the export model. The idea is to take the successful Israeli model the social and political model that exists inside the state of Israel, and somehow expand it into the territories that were conquered in 1967, with particular emphasis on the West Bank. That's the fantasy of the Israeli right wing for the first 15 years or so after 1967. I call it a fantasy because it depends on several impossible programs along the way that become clear in those first 15 years after 67. It rests on a certain demographic fantasy, a certain fantasy about Aliyah, a certain fantasy about the ability to change international perceptions of Israel and its conflict with the Arab states, and a certain fantasy about the capacity of Israel's Arab enemies to accept the new reality that Israel's going to create, and most of all, a certain fantasy about the import and the strength of Palestinian nationalism and the Palestinian national movement. What happens in the late 1970s to the early 1980s at the absolute latest is that at an elite level, at least, on the Israeli right, there's a dawning realization that this political program is impossible, that there will never be a successful export of Israel into the territories. That realization then seeps down from an elite level to a more popular level on the right, somewhere in the late 1980s and early 1990s with the first Intifada. That is to say, this notion that the state of Israel will just have a new border somewhere around the Jordan River and that it will continue to exist as the state of Israel that we've known, a democratic state and a Jewish state with all of its legal structures, with full equal rights for all of its citizens, with the tenuous compromises between religion and state that we had known in the first couple of decades of the state's existence, that fantasy leaves. And nothing ever really completely replaces it, except for a mishmash of a certain kind of new status quo, a certain reluctance to make any moves, a certain fear of any big risks. And that's as far as the leadership of the mainstream right is concerned. Beneath that, of course, there's an alternative program that's spearheaded by the settler movement, which is less concerned with exporting the Israeli model to the territories and more concerned, particularly after about 1995, after Oslo II, with constructing an entirely alternative legal and political framework for life in the West Bank. And if anything, possibly importing aspects of that alternative social model into Israel. And the notable irony here is that what creates that new legal status in 1995 isn't the policy of any right-wing government. It's actually one of the agreements, one of the Oslo agreements that's signed by Rabin, in this case, Oslo II, the second autonomy agreement, the one that creates the areas A, B, and C, and the one that really formalizes the dual regime of the West Bank. So that's as far as the right is concerned. What we mean then by the left is, at least from 1967 onwards, and certainly from the 1970s onwards, is in opposition to this. A desire to preserve the Israeli model by somehow arriving at a political arrangement that allows Israel to withdraw from most, if not all, the territories that were conquered in 67, ideally in exchange for a peace agreement, whether it's with the Arab states or eventually later a reconciliation with the Palestinian national movement in general. That's what we think of when we think of a left. And for most of those years, we think of a left that imagines a formulation somewhere along the lines of territories for peace, but not just. What I want to talk about when I talk about a left is two different kinds of left in Israel that both play a very crucial role in Israeli politics and in both regulating the internal dispute in Israeli domestic affairs and in formulating alternative policies. And the way I'm going to do this, I admit right away, is very stylized. I'm rounding a lot of corners. Empirically, there's a million exceptions to what I'm going to say, but I want you to just think in these very, very, very simplistic and simplified terms. I'm going to categorize all forms of left in Israel as essentially belonging to one of two groups. The first one that I'm going to call the radical left, and the second one that I'll call the governing left. And both of these have very, very different missions in terms of what they're trying to accomplish. A governing left, which is going to be the third part of our discussion today and the biggest part of our discussion, is a political movement that seeks to win elections and implement some kind of political program. A program of reform, a program, like we said, that's roughly dominated by the desire for land for peace, and that is dominated by the fear that Israel, with all of the territories, can't continue to exist as a Jewish and democratic state. The role of a governing left is to win elections, form governments, implement policies. The role of a radical left is completely different. A radical left is not a place that seeks to win elections. It's not a place that seeks to convince 50% plus one of the citizens that it's correct. A radical left is a place that seeks to work from outside of a consensus, to raise issues and problems that aren't getting attention in the mainstream, and to suggest solutions, most of which have no hope of ever being implemented. And the dialectic that exists between what we would think of as a radical left and a governing left is, you can think of it like this, that a radical left can come up with 10 crazy ideas, and out of 10 crazy ideas, maybe 3 of them are sort of workable and require some kind of effort to make them more practicable. And out of that, maybe 1 can actually succeed in getting something like a majority of the public behind it and be seen to fruition. And you might not know in advance which of those 10 that's going to be. So a governing left needs a radical left and a properly functioning radical left in order to do its job. But again, the job of the governing left is to form a coalition not just in the parliamentary sense that we know in Israel, but really in this sort of broader social and political sense, to come up with a real political program that can actually be implemented, that can actually get a majority of people behind it and actually take place. When I think of this dialectic between a radical left and a governing left, it really has a heyday. It has a 15-year period that you can identify and say that this worked. This is how it actually happened. And that 15-year period is roughly from 1978 to 1993, which are pretty interesting dates actually in Israeli history. They happen to be 1 year after a dramatic election in 1977 and 1 year after a dramatic election in 1992. Most of those 15 years are characterized by right-wing government, or at least national unity government. And most of those years are characterized by a left that's in opposition. Most, but not all. And what's interesting about, and of course, 1978 is the year of the Camp David Accords as well, and 1993 is the year of Oslo. So it's not just that there's elections that matter here, there are external events, exogenous events that have a big impact on intellectual life in Israel. And what's interesting about that is that you have a functioning radical left that spends those 15 years where most of the time, nearly all the time, it's far away from the levers of power, making occasionally very bitter and very, very discomforting criticism of the way things are going in Israel, coming up with a whole bunch of ideas, like we said, very few of which are actually have any possibility of being implemented, but also coming up with a few very interesting ones. And you have a governing left that, although it's in and out of coalitions in Israel in those 15 years, spending time in the unity governments in particular from 1984 to 1990, essentially feels that it's in opposition and needs to come up with a real policy alternative. And they do it. I mean, this is astonishing for us to think about today, where we're so used to the idea of political opposition being, at best an obsessive hatred of a certain prime minister or these are 15 years where the people out of power spend almost their entire time trying to figure out how to get back into power and what they're going to do about the big problems that they identify. And by the time they do get back into power in 1992, there's a very, very clear sense of where they're going. There's a fully developed political program that's just waiting to be implemented. And within a year, more or less, is implemented. So it's a really astonishing intellectual process that happens in those 15 years. And I don't think anything like it has happened ever since. So my question is, why? What's gone wrong? So I said the second part of this talk would be much shorter, and that's really the question of what's gone wrong for the radical left, because I think it's the less interesting of the two problems here. I also think, again, ironically, when we're talking about something that we're calling radical, that the process that hollowed out the radical left was very gradual and actually very recent. It's really something that only happened in the 2000s. For me, the big problem that's happened with the radical left in Israel has been its recruitment to part of a global radical left, for which Israel and Zionism is at the center of some kind of quasi-conspiratorial evil. Part of this is literally an economic question. It's the only way you can survive in the NGO sector. Part of it's also a question of labor. There just aren't that many people out there in any radical left, not just in Israel, but in any country. And the ones that we have here spend most of their time writing in English for funding that's in English, for a global political ideology that might sound friendly to you if you're part of the Israeli radical left in how much it hates the occupation and how much it hates the settlement enterprise, but in reality isn't all that friendly possibly to hasn't arrived necessarily at those conclusions for the same reasons you have. And we see this in a lot of Israeli civil society, particularly in organizations that are connected with the radical left. They've given up on speaking to a local Israeli audience. They've given up on even conceiving of the problems in terms and in language that would be familiar to the Israeli political discourse, and work very much on as part of a global pressure movement. This kind of radical left isn't going to be coming up with the out of consensus critiques that the previous generation of radical left did. This kind of radical left is not going to be coming up with the 10 creative ideas out of which only 3 are realistic the way its previous generation did. The contribution that this kind of radical left can make to any kind of dramatic change in response to real policy failure, which is how things move, by the way, right? I mean, people work on ideas that are outside the consensus. Some kind of external shock happens, like the Yom Kippur War, like the Lebanon War, like Sadat's visit, and suddenly you have all of these ideas that were being worked on the outside, and they're available. Nothing like that is happening today, or very little like that is happening in the radical left as we know it. Where I think really, if I had to summarize what went wrong there, it's that loss of a common language with the Israeli public and the total dependence on a global network of radical left, which for its own reasons that have nothing to do with us, is committed to a theological idea of irreducible Israeli evil. So we get to the third part of the discussion, which is the much more interesting one, which is what happened to Israel's governing left, as personified maybe by the Labor Party or by the labor movement, but not just, by an entire intellectual ecosystem of people who are not radical, of people who do want to win, and of people who do want to resist the right-wing program of the settlement enterprise and of the alternative regime that the settlement enterprise has constructed in the West Bank and threatens to import into Israeli life. So you remember how I said that what happened to the radical left was actually very gradual and very recent. What happened to the governing left wasn't gradual at all. The shift there was very, very, very sudden. And in fact, I would locate it in a distinct 10-month period between November 1995 and September 1996. But to get to that, let's understand what the standard stories that are told, why I think they're wrong, and then talk about what actually happened, because I see it. The standard stories that are told usually are, well, there's two. One is the story that I call Israel has moved, and the second is the story about this post-revolutionary fatigue. The Israel has moved story basically just says, well, the Israelis have moved rightward. People love saying that. You can read that all the time, the inexorable rightward shift of the Israeli public, all this stuff like that. There's just one problem. There's absolutely no data to back this up. Not in public opinion data and not in the data of the elections. The percentage of Israelis on the major issues of the conflict, the center of gravity for what's regarded as an acceptable opinion today regarding two states, regarding staying in the territories, regarding making peace, is far to the left of what it was 10 years ago, which was far to the left of what it was 10 years before that, both in public opinion and in, let's say, the number of members of Knesset who support a Palestinian state. That was a radical view in the 1990s. Rabin himself, to his last day, publicly opposed the Palestinian state. Same thing on a whole host of social issues. Same thing, by the way, on a whole host of issues having to do with the relationship between the Jewish majority and the Arab minority in Israel. Same, by the way, on things that we take for granted, like the status of the Arabic language and in public life. As recently as 2000, you didn't see all three languages on most street signs or highway signs in Israel. And you certainly didn't see media personalities who were on Israeli television the way you do today, although there's still a long way to go. A subset of the Israel has moved explanation is the demographic determinism, right? The sense that, well, all these changes happening in Israel because of ethnic composition and religion and fertility rates and whatever, and it just makes for a much more conservative public. Now, there's a reason why the demographic explanations have so much purchase. It's because they worked once in one kind of argument. And sometimes when a certain kind of argument works somewhere, people assume it works everywhere else. When we used to argue about whether or not we could stay in the West Bank forever, the demographic argument was crucial because we were counting Jews and Arabs. The thing about Jews and Arabs is that, with very few exceptions, when somebody's born Jewish or born Arab in the way that we conceive of those terms in this context, in this land, not necessarily, by the way, elsewhere, but as those terms stand here, if you're born Jewish or born Arab, chances are you're going to remain that way the rest of your life. So if we know the birth rates and death rates and migration rates, we can make some very, very excellent predictions about what the demographic balance between Jews and Arabs will look like in 5 years, 10 years, et cetera. But extrapolating from that to things like the internal distribution of religious affiliation among Jews or ethnic distributions among Jews in Israel is a much, much more precarious endeavor. We don't know very much based on whether you're born Haredi or modern Orthodox or traditional or secular. People's religious affiliations and their ideological affiliations are not something they're born with, they keep with the rest of their life. Their responses often to economic incentives, responses to trends, responses to changing ideas, responsive to external events. Certainly the Six-Day War had a much bigger impact on the rise of a national religious movement, the rise and later the demographic fall of a national religious movement than birth rates. And the same is true, by the way, for economic incentives and the balance between secular and Haredi. And the same is true for shocking exogenous events, quite possibly like the pandemic we're living through right now. If I brought you statistics from Britain about the percentage of Britons 50 years ago who were religious and secular, and the number of children that were being had in religious families and secular families in Britain, you would never predict that in 2020, Britain would be an almost completely atheist country based on that. So it's not a very effective way. What it is effective, by the way, is at helping people just giving up, especially on the governing left, of just deciding, well, the public's against us, which is a great way, by the way, of alienating the public. The second explanation, besides this demographic determinism and this Israel has moved explanation, is the post-revolutionary one, which says, well, the labor movement brought us the state, it did all these things, but like a lot of liberation movements, it didn't really know how to function with a state. That's been true in a few other countries, but it's not a universal truth. And it hasn't been true in all national liberation movements. But for the Israeli Labor Party in particular, and for the Israeli left in general, it leaves out so much of their history, because actually they did reinvent themselves multiple times. It was not just a revolutionary movement. It didn't continue to exist in politics in the 1970s and 80s and 90s, just living off of the interest of 1948 and 67. It did make several changes, by the way, that very self-consciously ate into its own power. I mean, one of the things you saw in the 1970s was this entire edifice of civil society and of civil service that were, quite unlike in many other newly independent countries, genuinely independent of political pressure, so that when it came time to investigate corrupt politicians and report on them in the public broadcasting media, it was done. And the greatest success that the state building generation of laborites had was arguably their fall from power in 77. It was proof that the state they had built was actually stronger than they were. But they did reinvent themselves after the Yom Kippur War, and they did reinvent themselves after the economic crisis of the 80s. And they even reinvented themselves after one of the things that many people on the left regret, which is the big healthcare reform of the 1990s, which decoupled membership in the Histadrut from health coverage, which was rough on the party because it deprived it of a big source of income. It also deprived it of a way of a big means of recruitment. But again, I don't think it's the case that it wasn't able to reinvent itself even then, because it actually came back to win elections after that. The truth is, as I see it at least, that what killed the left was the results of the Oslo process. And that not only did it come into power in 1992 with a fully formed political program, as we discussed earlier, but that the political program failed. Now, political failure isn't usually a death sentence for a political party or a political movement. Lots of political failures happen. Lots of policy failure has to happen. And usually political parties or political movements are able to bounce back from that and reinvent themselves. So why was this one so special? Why was this one so damaging? I would identify 4 promises that were key to the Oslo process in the early 1990s. 4 implicit promises that the left-wing establishment made with the public for this process. And I think all 4 of them didn't come to fruition. So the first was that there would be an improvement in personal security, particularly from terrorism. The second was that there would be a reduction in the security burden on our lives, that we would maybe have shorter army service, wouldn't be living with security guards everywhere, wouldn't. And the third was that there would be a genuine reconciliation with the Arab world. And the fourth was that Israel would be able to restore some kind of international backing, which many felt that it had lost in the 1980s in Lebanon and in the first Intifada, and that if the peace process failed, it would be obvious to everyone that Israel was the good guy and the world would stand by us. None of these 4 things happened. On the first, almost immediately, we saw for the first time in Israel, a suicide bombing in April of 1994, and then another one also in April of 94, and then later again in November of 94, and then through 95 and 96. There was a bit of a break in 98, 99, but in 2000 they came back. We saw a death toll from terrorism that wasn't not only lower than what we saw in the years leading up to Oslo, but considerably higher. On the second, there's a bit of a mixed record. For the most part, actually, we do have a lessened security burden, but it took a long time to get there. The truth is that even though the most hated tasks of the occupation are no longer a part of our lives in terms of patrolling refugee camps, putting down demonstrations, things like that, for the years of the Second Intifada, actually, we had a much larger burden than we ever had before. And the payoffs there took a long time to come. Some were immediate, but then undone by the Second Intifada, and the rest took actually quite some time, weren't perceptible. On the third, we didn't get there at all. We had a few diplomatic openings, but the reality is that most of the diplomatic openings that Israel had in the 1990s were before 1993, were in the early 1990s, and were the result of two big global events that had nothing to do with the Israeli-Palestinian process: the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, and the Persian Gulf War in 1991, which effectively ended the Arab boycott. It was after the end of the Cold War in '89 that we suddenly started having embassies in all over Eastern Europe and Asia and Africa. And it was after 1991 that we suddenly saw in Israel all these international name brands that we hadn't seen here before because of the Arab boycott. In the memory of the Israeli left, all that is thanks to Oslo, but it preceded it. The reconciliation with the Arab world didn't really happen. We signed another peace treaty with Jordan in 1994, but as with Egypt, there was no normalization. And there were a few missions that were opened in some peripheral states in the Arab world. Those were all closed after the Second Intifada broke out. On the contrary, with the advent of satellite television and mass media in the Arab world, we found ourselves more hated than ever and more central to a kind of totemic identity in the Middle East and among Arab and Muslim minorities outside of the Middle East. And the fourth is maybe the most disappointing, that as the process was going on in the 1990s, and as Israel, for the most part, kept its obligations and withdrew from the territories it was supposed to withdraw from in each of the interim agreements, and the Palestinians didn't keep their obligations, and terrorism continued to increase, and especially after the final status talks broke down completely and the Second Intifada was launched, we found that all the places in the global community that we expected to stand by us didn't. We were just as much the guilty party in the 1990s and 2000s as we were in the 1980s. And I think this was a shock too, to most of the left. So all that came at a very, very heavy price. What's interesting is that nevertheless, in the last generation, all of the electoral victories of the right religious settler bloc, have been very, very narrow. And the three times that the right has been defeated electorally in 1992, 1999, and 2006 was all by a landslide. But the other thing to remember is that all three of those times in 92, 99, and 2006, what the Israeli public experienced was, after those landslide victories for the center-left bloc, a huge decline in its security. And almost an irreversible one. So it was during the years after 92 that we had the wave of suicide bombings. It was in the years after the 99 victory that we had the Second Intifada, and it was in the years after 2006 that we had rocket attacks from north and south. To not come to terms with this, to not present a coherent explanation for this and an alternative policy, is to relegate oneself to permanent opposition. So why didn't that happen? The fact that there were failures on this order isn't special to the Israeli left. I'll give you an example. Maybe it's a sensitive example to be talking about in the Begin Heritage Center, I don't know, but I'll do it anyway. Probably the single biggest geostrategic catastrophe or security catastrophe that Israel ever embarked on in its history was the war in Lebanon in 1982. And the Likud still manages to maintain relevance. I mean, it ended Begin's career. And there was a big political cost for the right wing temporarily. But it manages to reinvent itself and recover from that. Just as, by the way, Labor had from Yom Kippur, just as both parties did from the hyperinflation, just as you can think of happens elsewhere in the world with political catastrophes. Political catastrophes happen all the time. So what was different here? Well, number one was it was so wedded to that intellectual process that we talked about before. So this wasn't just a policy failure. This was a policy failure that was connected at the deepest level to an intellectual identity, to an ethical identity. And B, I think there was that critical 10-month period of these three huge psychological shocks that made it impossible to reassess. First was the murder of Prime Minister Rabin in November of 95. Second was the very, very painful electoral defeat in May of 1996. I'll talk for a second about why that's so painful. And third was the riots in September 1996 after the opening of the Western Wall tunnel, the opening of the exit to the Western Wall tunnel. On the murder of Rabin, there's not a lot that I can say that would be new or revealing to anyone. It's obvious why that was such a shocking event, and it's obvious why that would make any kind of critical conversation about his most important political contribution difficult to do, at least initially. I mean, now it's been 25 years and there's a difference. Also, his place in Israeli history is assured, and we have a bigger view of his whole life. But in the aftermath of his murder, which wasn't just a random murder, it was a very politically motivated murder precisely because of his efforts to make peace in Oslo with the Palestinians, it would have been very, very difficult to, on the one hand, mourn his death, understand that it had happened and why it had happened, and within less than a year say, oh, and his landmark policy isn't actually working, we might need to revisit that. It's a very difficult task. The second thing that happened was the election of somebody who for most of the left is a hated figure, particularly after the Rabin murder, but also a very close margin. I remember once listening, not in Israel, I think it was in the US, it was a political consultant who said, if you're ever going to lose an election, make sure you lose by a large margin. The politicians who lose by a tiny margin never recover psychologically. So to have the murder in November and then the election defeat by a fraction of a percent in May is rough. Again, makes it very hard to critically engage with the policy failures that are happening all around. And lastly, in September, to have this very shocking event where a lie about a threat to Al-Aqsa Mosque from a tunnel that doesn't run under the mosque is used as a pretext for 3 days of violence, where the forces that had been created by the peace agreement end up opening fire on Tzahal, was also an incredible shock. In a way that is almost hard to recognize, the center of gravity of that governing left, we're not talking about the radical left, of that center left by the end of 1996, in terms of where the views are on all the major issues, 2 states, division of Jerusalem, the extent of withdrawals, settlement, everything shifted dramatically. What is now a mainstream opinion in the center left by the end of 1996, and certainly by the election in 1999, would be unrecognizable to Rabin in 1995 and 1994 and his supporters. But the rest of the country hadn't moved with them. So needing to make that kind of critical engagement with a policy failure that, like I said, isn't unprecedented. It's a big one. It's not the biggest, and it's certainly not alone. In a situation where the failure is central to a psychological and ethical identity, and there are these three massive, shocking events that are happening right at that time, made it impossible. And for some reason, with the passage of more than 20 years, very little has shaken that. Now, you still had in those years a functioning radical left. The radical left didn't lose its relevance for at least another 10 years, somewhere in the 2000s where that happens. But the radical left can't do very much on its own. As we said, it works best when it has that dialectic going with people who can actually do something with its ideas. And that moderate governing left, the left that can win elections, the left that can implement policies, the left that can get things done, wasn't there. And to my mind, still isn't there. And further to my mind, is probably pretty desperately needed, but that's a different issue. How about I pause here and we take some questions and comments?
Okay, thank you, Shany. That was wonderful. Thank you. A lot of information, a lot of analysis, and I think we all learned something new and a different analysis from what we often hear on this topic. So thank you very much. We have a question. I have a couple of questions myself, but I want to give the public the chance to get to you first. So there's a question here. I'm going to read it as it's written. I'd like to ask why, this is from Gabby Brahm. I'd like to ask why Dr. Mor thinks the Israeli radical left lost touch and got lost in the way it did. Why did it become more a pet of the global postmodern anti-Zionist left than anything else? It's complicated, I suppose, but what does he say as he seems to understand these things? Aren't they still proposing stuff that can't possibly work as they're supposed to do? It's because the moderate left disappeared?
Okay, that's an excellent question. So there's several things that are wrapped in there. I would say this: it's an economic and a labor question. The amount of radical left that any population can sustain is pretty small. You know, I mean, there's a few academics, a few NGOs, and things like that. There isn't that much out there, and today most of them are busy on these. Look, if you want to understand where the Israeli radical left is today, the best place to look is at a website called 972 Mag. And there's a couple things there. First of all, it's in English. They do have a sister publication in Hebrew called Sicha Mekomit. But the bulk of the work there is in English. You have lots of very, very, very brilliant and intelligent people there. And sometimes they analyze things. Sometimes they're economists, and sometimes they're sociologists, and sometimes they're military experts, and sometimes they're all sorts of things. I have never once read something there that surprised me in the least bit. No matter what the issue is, the conclusion always is Israel's bad, Israelis are racist. And there are people who lap this up. I mean, there are people who really, really want this. There's a demand for this. The demand for that has a lot to do with things that have happened to the global left. It has very little to do with stuff here. Now, if all of the manpower that we have in Israel that could be sustaining an Israeli radical left is producing that kind of content, it's not going to do very much. Now, if you confront them with this, many of them will tell you, and this is an example of sort of an adaptive preference. Many of them will tell you, yes, well, we're very self-conscious about that. What we have consciously decided is it's pointless to engage the Israeli public. The only way to get change is to campaign against Israel abroad and use international forums as a means of pressure.
Okay. Marcel Danon asks, can the moderate left ever recover in Israel? And maybe I'll add to that, if so, how?
Yes, I think it can, in two ways. One is it needs to present a coherent political program, the way it did, by the way, in 92, the way it actually did, by the way, in 99 and 2006 as well. but particularly 92, it needs to actually present a coherent political program. And the way you present a coherent political program is to think critically about what's happened. To think critically about what's happened, to make a reasoned assessment about it, to say something about what you think needs to be done and can be done in a way that can work politically. That's very different from the way a radical element would work, right? I mean, it's not an ideal method of policy. It's a, how do I get to 50% plus one, and how can I actually make this happen? There is a place for that. And I think there's a public that's eager to hear it and willing to hear it, by the way, if we look at what people's opinions are on the actual problems that are out there. The second thing is it needs to get over its obsession with Netanyahu and his wife and son and whatever. Maybe he'll be gone soon and that'll help everyone. I don't know. But that's not a way of winning. And it's certainly not a way of coming up with coherent policies.
Maybe I can just follow up. There's a few more questions, but I want to just follow up on that with a question of my own. I wonder whether, we have this kind of, as you've alluded to, there's not a great deal of support for right-wing plans, specifically right-wing activist plans like annexation. But that it does seem like the right can win elections by essentially favoring a status quo on the issue of the Palestinians and the territories, and that whenever the left or centre left has tried to implement some new idea, it's ended up also, as you've stated, going wrong, specifically going wrong in regards to personal security. So when unilateral disengagement was all the rage, and Kadima was elected on that platform, and Likud would collapsed in the polls in 2006, that sort of dies a death because of Gaza and because of Lebanon, right? And Hezbollah and Hamas proving the right argument that you can't unilaterally disengage because these places are become terrorist havens. So is the answer, or part of the answer to the political program that the left have to come up with in order to win, is it to basically say, we kind of accept that there's going to have to be some sort of basic status quo on the Palestinian front for now, and we need to focus our energies in some other area, whether it's issues around democracy or religion and state or that kind of thing, or does the answer still lie in a specific left alternative to the status quo with the Palestinians?
Yeah, I think that where the right appears to win the argument, but hasn't actually won the argument, is by blurring the distinction between the debate about the occupation and the debate about the settlement enterprise. Right. So the security status quo, even if that is the winning argument, and I'm not convinced it is, by the way, but even if that were the winning argument, right, that a kind of unpleasant security status quo is necessary to, in the immediate term, maintain a normal daily life until we can reach a political breakthrough, that doesn't necessarily translate into the special civilian regime of Jewish ascendancy in the West Bank. And it doesn't translate, by the way, into broad Israeli support for that enterprise. And every time it's been tested, by the way, I mean, the thing that's crucial for the right wing in this case is to never have that problem tested, because every time it has been tested, what the right has discovered is they don't have the public behind them. They can get the public behind them on certain security matters, but when it comes to considering the Israeli national interest versus the interest of the settlement enterprise, all but at most 5-10% of the public do not care about the settlement enterprise and are not willing to sacrifice real Israeli strategic interests for it. So they need to have that distinction blurred. If the center left wants to make its case, then number one, it needs to unblur that. It needs to make that distinction very, very clear. And also it needs to make a case, by the way, on the security issue. There's no reason to concede that ground to the right wing. We don't have enough time, but I don't think, I mean, you presented in your question kind of the standard right wing argument about why the disengagement was supposedly a failure. I'm not arguing with that right now, but just for the record, I want to be clear, I don't actually agree with that. I think there's a counter argument to be made.
Okay, great. Okay, so back to questions from the audience. there's a point here which is, I guess, a response to your comment about the radical left, or maybe about the left generally. But what about the protesters? What about the big protest movement, the weekly protests against Netanyahu? How does that fit into the left, radical left division? Are they part of either of those, both of those?
As far as I can tell, they bring together both of those and more. But those are, I mean, that is an excellent way of, and maybe this is the only way to get things done, but that is an excellent way of bringing down one kind of government. It's not anything you can build on no later. It's possible that that's a crucial first step. But the protests have, by not dealing with any political issues, by really focusing only on Netanyahu and his corruption problems, managed to be a big tent for everyone. There's a very large presence there of radical left, even if kind of the people who are leading the protest and financing it and making the major claims are not there. Okay.
Question here from Moshe. Well, it's Moshe and Sheila Brody. I don't know if it's from both of them or one of them, but it's a kind of challenge, I guess. You spoke repeatedly about the, quote, fantasies of the right, but what about the disastrous failure of Oslo and all the other attempts at a peace process? Doesn't that classify as a fantasy? Doesn't the governing left also have its own fantasies?
Yeah, I think I made it very clear that Oslo was a failure. It didn't work. And not just in 2000. I mean, it wasn't working right away from the very beginning. At the very, very beginning of the process, from the very first withdrawals, which were supposed to be reciprocated by Palestinian moves on annulling the charter, on extraditions, on a whole bunch of other things, they just weren't doing it. And not only that, there was an outbreak of violence that was almost immediate with stabbings. Actually, the stabbings were a holdover from before, but they accelerated after 93, and then from 94 onwards with suicide bombings. There wasn't just one failure, but as I enumerated, there were four failures, four things that were expected to happen, and the opposite happened. And that's something that has to be reckoned with.
Right. Okay. Francine Glassman says, you haven't mentioned the role of NGOs. Where do they fit in?
I think I did, but I mean, yes, maybe I didn't say the word NGO. I thought I did, but in what I was saying about the economic, and I don't mean economic just in terms of money, I mean also in the division of labor, what happens to the radical left. The pull of a kind of global discourse of irreducible Israeli evil makes the civil society organizations that were once crucial to an Israeli radical left, it just makes them less and less relevant.
Okay. Zev Portner, who's an old friend in the UK, asks, he asked a question which I think has already been answered about the future of the left, but he makes a specific point about whether the moderate left can win over Sephardi Mizrahi voters.
Could it? Yes.
Because clearly the Begin's, the Likud's capture of that demographic was crucial to the Likud winning in 77, and I think and I find today often you see this a very sort of, I mean, not just them, of course. I think Israel's a very tribal country and politically, but you often see that that political tribe is very loyal to the Likud.
Yes, but at the same time, half of Israeli marriages, Israeli Jewish marriages, are mixed. Right. These things mean less and less, and you only need to pull a certain percentage one way or another to change the outcome of an election. And there's a way to do it. I mean, and it's been done. Whether I think it's likely or immediate, I'm not sure, but there's certainly a place for a center-left, social democratic, Zionist political party, whether it has the title Labor or not. Labor, I don't know if we'll see that name anymore, but there is a place for that in Israeli politics.
Okay, there's a couple of questions which are connected to what's going on in the United States. So Robin Gottlieb asks if she thinks that the radical left in the US, what he thinks about the radical left in the US, falsely claiming, she says, to be progressives. Are they trying to become the governing left, or are they part of this kind of radical left which doesn't really care so much about governing? Jonah Pressman asks, to what extent is the Israeli political left modeling itself after the American political left?
So the US is a whole different topic. I wouldn't say too much about it, except that the radical left in the US is very, very far from the corridors of power and very far from being in a position of real influence. It has at most like 3 or 4 or 5 members of Congress. It has a certain dominance on some topics, and it's very loud on topics that concern us, that's for sure. But that the one thing that would determine whether it can become relevant is whether or not the Democrats are out of power. I mean, the one thing that will calm it down is if the Democrats are in power right now and adults in the room have some kind of responsibility. If there's a long-term situation of being out of power, that's an excellent opportunity for that kind of radical left to grow. And even an opportunity, although it seems like a very unlikely scenario, but even an opportunity to see something like what we saw in Britain in 2015, which is essentially a hostile takeover of a mainstream center-left party by a really niche radical element, which they did and held onto for 5 years. You wouldn't have predicted that before 2015. But to imagine something like that happening to the Democratic Party in the U.S., I don't want to say it's impossible, but it just seems really unlikely. But of course it's not impossible.
And the second part of that question was about whether the Israeli political left is in some way modeling itself on the American left.
I have no idea if that's the case, but I mean, we live in a very globalized world where we're all feeding off each other and living off each other, and seeing what's going on in other countries. And that has an influence on the Israeli political discourse, not just on the left, but everywhere. I mean, we've seen in Israel an organization called Kohelet, which has an enormous influence on a certain intellectual discourse in the right, and has brought a whole bunch of funny ideas into an almost mainstream presence in Israel, things that should have no purchase on Israeli political discourse, like libertarianism and like liberalizing gun ownership laws and things like that. And suddenly you find them popping up. You also, by the way, find not from Kohelet, but from other places, popping up in Israeli life, posters about abortion and things like that, which also are rather foreign in terms of their centrality to the Israeli political debate. So yeah, we're a tiny country in a big world. That's always going to have its impact.
Connected to that, and I think this is a very current question about social media. So there's a lot that's been written, that's being talked about the impact of social media and the detrimental impact of social media on politics and on democracy around the world. The question here from Victoria Braverman is, she asks if it's possible, if it's even possible for the radical left to disassociate from the global radical left. And if not, does social media mean that any ideas which are accepted by the governing left would automatically be met with hostility by the vast majority of the Israeli public? I guess because social media would connect them with the anti-Zionist radical left, global left.
So the second question is easier to answer. I don't think that's the case. I think good politics can adapt to changing media environments. The first question is really difficult. I don't know what the solution to that is. I do think, by the way, that one thing that would be very helpful to Israeli political intellectual life would be if political parties get a lot of public funding. In fact, one of the highest levels of public funding in the world. People aren't aware of that. But almost all that goes into campaigns, and there are requirements on public funding. There's requirements, by the way, dealing with gender equality and things like that. There aren't requirements or very strict requirements about research divisions. I think if the political parties in Israel had their own well-budgeted research divisions, that we would see an intellectual discourse that's much less dependent on foreign-funded think tanks, which are not aligned with political parties, which do often unwittingly impose categories that are entirely foreign to Israeli politics on a bunch of other issues. We would get much more investment in making political platforms, including, by the way, for parties that are not terribly mainstream. And in Israel, you have at least 12 parties in every Knesset. Okay, some of them are very far from the mainstream for all sorts of reasons. And if they too were making platforms together with the mainstream parties, by the way, the party that has been in power in Israel for the last 11 years, for the last 8 of those years, has been in power following elections where it made no platform. It issued, I mean, the platforms are kind of baloney anyway. They're little booklets that have all these aspirational, but even the hypocrisy of them has some virtue. And the main governing party in Israel just stopped writing policy platforms, which kind of is its own platform when you think about it. So I think if we could somehow bring back the world of policy planning, and it's particularly important for a party when it's in opposition, much more than when it's in government. When you're in government, I don't think you need to be wasting your time thinking about big ideas. You need to actually be taking care of the stuff that's happening. But when you're out of power, that's what you should be focusing on. So this happens in countries like Germany is a really good example, where political parties have research divisions and where policy planning exists in a framework of party politics, not just in billionaire endowed think tanks, and certainly not in billionaire endowed think tanks where all the billionaires are foreign citizens.
Right. There's a question here from Yoni who refers to your comment about how the data shows that Israel is not, in fact, moving rightward in its opinions. And he says that, why do you think that the people think that? Is it solely due to Netanyahu being in power for a decade, or is there something else driving this view? And should the left be doing more to correct this false narrative as a way of reviving itself in the public eye?
I don't think it's because Netanyahu is in power. I think it's precisely because of the cognitive dissonance resolution that emerges from the failure of Oslo. If it's the public's fault, if all the people around me are just awful, I don't need to ask myself difficult questions about my own failures. And this is a winning formula, by the way, for continuing to lose elections. If your explanation for why things are bad is it's not me, it's all these people out there, just look at them, they're not going to like you all that much, and you're going to keep losing elections.
Right. Deplorables, for example. Yes. Okay. I think we've basically finished with the questions here. I want to ask one final question from me, which is sort of bringing us into contemporary Israel, very contemporary Israel. So, as I said right at the beginning, the Labour Party is practically defunct right now in the Knesset, and you have the leading opposition party is Yesh Atid, which defines itself as centrist, but comprises people like Ofer Shelach, who's on the left, and Bogi Ya'alon, who's basically a Likudnik. Do you see that this current situation, where you have a right-wing party in Likud as the major party, and then the opposition is a party which defines itself as centrist, which isn't going to get into the mire on the Palestinian issue, but is really sort of presenting itself as a party that defends sort of Israeli liberal democratic values, that takes a stance on the nation state law, that kind of thing, and certainly on the corruption issues around Netanyahu. Is that something that's going to continue for as long as the left doesn't get its act together?
There's two things in that question. One is what can politics look like as long as Netanyahu is here and as long as he has his legal troubles, and that's external to the discussion that we're having about the Israeli left. So that's a big aspect of it that is outside, that's orthogonal to what you and I are talking about. The other question is, can you win and do anything with that? And I'm very skeptical. the way to make any change is to come with some sort of genuine policy alternative, a reason to vote for you that will change things, and a way to then do that gets you hopefully half plus one of the public, and more critically, half plus one of the members of the parliament, which, by the way, today involves understanding not just that there are 15 or 16 ultra-Orthodox MPs, but also that there are going to be 13 to 15 Arab MPs from Arab parties. And that has to be part of your equation too.
Great. I said that was the last question. With your permission, I want to present one more question to you, because Yitzhak Firestein has written something which I think which hasn't been at least directly addressed by other questions. Your analysis, he says, doesn't really address the political program of the Palestinians, which most Israelis now understand to be entirely hostile to a Jewish state. The left view is that the Palestinians either don't mean what they say or will be appeased with some kind of compromise. Unfortunately, like the global left, the Palestinians have a theological view of Israel as entirely evil. If so, what does the moderate left have to offer?
Again, what the left in all of its forms is more frightened of than anything else is a reality where Israel has a non-Jewish majority, or even a very large non-Jewish minority, and exists as a state that is not particularly Jewish, not particularly democratic, and what anyone on the left, regardless of how radical or moderate or centrist they might be, does not want to have is a state of Israel, here where I am in Tel Aviv, or where you are in Jerusalem, or anywhere in the north or the south, that looks anything at all like the settler regime in the West Bank. A place where a tiny minority of entitled Jews live a first world standard of living, surrounded by a very hostile majority of Arabs in a basically third world standard of living, with no political or civil rights and no realistic way of getting them. That's something that, regardless of how naive or cynical we might be about the intentions of Israel's enemies, and I'm certainly on the more skeptical side of that spectrum, but there are others who might be on the more naive one, that regardless of where we fall on that is a vision that nobody in the center of the left in Israel is willing to accept as a way of life here.
Okay, thank you very much. That was a very categorical answer, which is nice. Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Shany Mor. That was incredibly educational and enlightening, and a great way to conclude this series. To everyone else, thank you for joining us. Next week, we're going to be talking about the recently signed normalization agreements with the UAE and Bahrain. I'll send out details to those on my mailing list, and you can also find details on our website and Facebook page. Anyone not on my mailing list that wants to be, please email me, paulg, P-A-U-L-G, @beginCenter.org.il. Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much, Shany, again, and have a good evening.
Thank you.